welcome to those who have just arrived. It's good to have you with us. We're continuing this morning our short series on the book of Hebrews. And in this passage that Deborah has just read to us, Jesus is likened to the high priest. The high priest in the temple in Jerusalem. And actually, the high priest in the temple at that time was quite an impressive figure. If you saw the high priest, there's no way that you would miss that person. There's no way you would miss their significance. What they had to wear was specified right back in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus chapter 28. And I've got for us, I'm going to put on the PowerPoint now if we can do that, just some of the key things that that high priest would wear. If we can switch, please, Douglas, to the PowerPoints. The high priest would look something like that. Key things to point out are that along the bottom of that sort of little bit of a tunic thing he's wearing, he's got there bells, and between the bells he's got sort of embroidered pomegranates, like little fruits. So there's a pomegranate with a fruit embroidered, and there's a bell, and then there's a pomegranate and a bell. All around the bottom of that sort of apron-like thing, the ephod that he's wearing, he's got those. I suspect that picture, my guess is it would have been probably slightly longer. So he's got that there. And then on his shoulder pieces, he's got two onyx stones. And the onyx stones have engraved in them the names of the tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel, 6 on each. So on his shoulders, he's got the names of the tribes of Israel. He's also wearing a breastplate. And the breastplate, again, has 12 stones. And guess what's engraved on the 12 stones? Once again, the names of the tribes of Israel. They're on the breastplate. And finally, on his head, he's got a turban. And the turban had a band around it, and on the turban it had the words written, "Holy to the Lord." Why? Why do you think he had bells around the bottom of the ephod, the thing that he was wearing? Well, every time the high priest moved in the temple, there'd be this jingling sound. Who is the person who's going to be most noticed in the temple? The one who's making the jingling sound. It really did emphasize that in this massive temple in Jerusalem, this is the key person. Everywhere he went, every movement he made, the focus was on that person. Such was the significance of the high priest. And the high priest, there on that ephod, he carried next to his heart all the names of the people of Israel. So it's the people of Israel are on his heart, on his chest. The names are also on his shoulders. It indicates that he's carrying the burden of the people of Israel there in the temple. In his ephod, he also had two curious things. They're called the Urim and the Thummim. They were like two stones that in ancient times they used to cast to try and determine what might God's will be in the very primitive times. So they thought, does God want us to do this or does God want us to do that? They would take out these two stones and they would cast the Urim and the Thummim, and depending on how they fell, they would get as an indication of what God was calling them to do. They do that these days, of course. We'll come back to that later. But such was the role of the priest. And the key role of the priest was to go into the most holy place. For anybody who knows the temple, in the temple there was a veil, a thick veil, that cut off where they visualized God as dwelling from the rest. And once every year, the high priest would go in there. To go in there, the high priest would make offering, would make his purpose of going in was to make an offering for the people and to carry the burden of the people into God's. But before he could do that, he had to make an offering for himself. Because though the high priest was very carefully chosen, the high priest was a human being like the rest of us, and therefore did wrong. And nobody who is sinful before God, who has done wrong, who is wrong within them, could go in before God. So the high priest had to make an offering for himself for the wrong that he'd done for his sin before he went to make the offering for others, to take that before God. In fact, even when he went into behind the veil, which he only did once a year, and the high priest was the only person who ever did that, they used to tie a cord around him, just in case God's displeasure fell on him and he were to die in there, so they could pull out the body without anybody else risking themselves by going in. Such was the impression of holiness to approach. And what we see in our passage is Jesus is likened to this illustration of the high priest. In fact, no, I'll leave the high priest up there while we go through this morning. You can switch from it at the back if we want to do so. But Jesus is likened to this person, the high priest. But the high priest had to be descended from Aaron. One of the requirements back in Exodus was the high priest had to be of the tribe of Levi, descended from Aaron. So we have the idea of the Levites being the priests, and from the Levites, a high priest could be chosen. Jesus is likened to the high priest, but Jesus wasn't a Levite. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. And therefore, it might be helpful this morning for us to, in our understanding of this passage, for us to try and visualize or imagine a Jewish neighbor of that period, a Jewish neighbor of that time who is critical, who is skeptical of this idea of how could Jesus be the high priest? It might be an idea, Douglas, if we switch from the image to whether they're going to be seen at home more easily, it might just help. This critical Jewish neighbor of the time would ask, well, okay, how was Jesus selected? How can Jesus be chosen to be the high priest? Because the high priest has got to be a Levite. Well, the answer for that we find in verses 5 and 6. And in verses 5 and 6, they actually quote two psalms. The two psalms they quote are Psalm 2 and Psalm 10. That's quite important, actually. Do you remember when earlier on, when we introduced this sort of little series on Hebrews 2 weeks ago, we said that some people say, oh, I like Jesus of the Gospels, but I'm not so sure about the epistles. And we said, actually, that's not a point, because actually the epistles give us the understanding of the Gospels. Well, in the same way, sometimes people say, I like the New Testament, but I don't like the Old Testament. And we can't do that, because without an understanding of the Old Testament, we can't appreciate the New. And that's exactly what we see here. The understanding of the Old Testament and the New Testament are so entwined that we have to have a grasp of the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, we've got the Psalms, and certainly the Psalms are pointing to the coming of the Messiah. And that's the case in Psalms 2 and Psalm 10. And they're quoted here. The first one, verse 5, it says, he was chosen by God who said to him, you are my son. Today I have become your father. And the other psalm is quoted in verse 6. And in another passage, God said to him, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Think about those two verses for a moment. Let's take the first one, verse 5. He was chosen by God, who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." Do you remember when we looked at chapter 1 2 weeks ago? We focused on the fact that Jesus is fully divine. He is God. He always was God, God from the beginning. And then last week in chapter 2, we focused on the fact that Jesus is also fully human. Well, to understand this verse and this passage, we've got to grasp those two things. Jesus is and always was God the Son. He was there in the beginning. He's the one through whom all things were created. That's what we looked at in chapter 1. He always was God the Son. And he waited. He waited until the time was right. He waited until he was sent by the Father to come to earth, and then he became a human being. So yes, he was fully God, and he became fully human. And as fully human, he was obedient to God. And God adopted him as his son. So he was adopted as the Son of God. So the difference, he always was God the Son. He became the Son of God. Verse 5, he was chosen by God who said, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." But our skeptical Jewish neighbour, our critical Jewish neighbour says to us, yeah, but that he was adopted by God. That's how he was chosen, but he's not of the tribe of Levi. And that's where verse 6 comes in. And in another passage, God said to him, "You're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." The Levites became the priestly people with Aaron at the time of Moses. Just after the Exodus, the priesthood was established then. This chap Melchizedek is an interesting character in the Old Testament. We actually only read about him in two passages. He appears, and we're told a story about him in Genesis chapter 14. That's several hundred years before Moses and the Exodus. So we've got this passage in Genesis chapter 14, and he's mentioned again in Psalm 110. And in Genesis chapter 14, Abraham is met by this man who's a priest king. He's a priest in that he's a priest to the one true God. Back in very early times, he was a priest of God. And he was also a king. He was king of Salem, which later became Jerusalem. Yeah, it was the early name for Jerusalem was Salem. He was king of Salem, and he was also a priest. And he met, and there's a great story with Abraham, and Abraham gives him 10% of all that he has. And he's a priest. He's a priest several hundred years before Aaron, before the Levites were established to the priesthood. The Levite priesthood continued. The book of Hebrews was written probably just a bit before, sometime before AD 70. In AD 70, the fabulous temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. And that was the end of the Levitical priesthood. So the Levitical priesthood was from Moses to the fall of the temple in AD 70. The priesthood of Melchizedek, however, was much earlier. It was an earlier priesthood. And in Jesus, it continues forever. It's an eternal priesthood. So, yes, Jesus was chosen by God to be high priest. He was a priest, not of the Levitical order. He was a priest in the order of Melchizedek. But then our critical Jewish neighbour says to us, yeah, but if that's the case, how can this Jesus represent us? After all, our Old Testament priest had a sympathy with our situation. Before he went and made an offering for our sins, he made an offering for his own sins. How can Jesus have that sympathy? There was a sort of a solidarity between that priest who knew if he went in behind the veil into the holy place, had a cord tied around it so they could pull him out. There's a solidarity between us and that priest. How can the same be true for Jesus? Verse 8 answers the question. It says in verse 8, even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. Jesus learning obedience from the things that he suffered. When do we see most Jesus learning obedience to God the Father? I would say in the Garden of Gethsemane, on the night that he was arrested before his trial, knowing what lay ahead of him, knowing that lying ahead of him was the cross, was crucifixion. Not only the pain of that, but he knew that in the crucifixion, it would mean him suffering the separation from God, that had he not done that, all of us would have suffered from. That separation, being cut off from God. And there, in the Garden of Gethsemane, many of us know the story. He'd gone there with his disciples. He'd left his disciples to pray, but they fell asleep. He'd gone off into a quiet place on his own, and he prayed in great anguish, Lord, if it's possible, may this suffering that I'm facing be taken from me. He said, but nevertheless, not what you want, not what I want, but what you want. I've said often before here in St. George's that actually I'm told by people who've been to Garden of Gethsemane that if you stand there and you look out, it looks out even now onto open wasteland, the sort of place where a man could run, could hide and would never be found. So actually not going to the cross was a real option. And that was the human Jesus would have wanted to take that. But he said, not what I want, but what you want. Verse 8, even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from suffering. There's the solidarity. There is the solidarity that gives him sympathy and understanding. He faced the isolation that we would have faced. He's sympathetic when we struggle with obedience, because he has struggled with obedience to the Father as well. But that is what he was called to. And he went on, and he offered himself as a sacrifice, carrying on his heart those with whom he had that sympathy, those of us who he knows struggle with isolation, with facing separation from God, struggle with the call to obedience. He carried on his heart, he carried the burden of us, if you like, on his shoulders. He was truly the high priest. Well, I think we've answered pretty well the criticisms of our ancient times Jewish neighbour. What about the criticism of our 21st century neighbour? The criticism of the 21st century neighbour says, okay, well, Jesus learned obedience. What do I have to do? Verse 9, it says, in this way, God qualified him as the perfect high priest, and he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. Jesus became the source of eternal salvation We are no longer facing separation from God because of what Jesus did. How do we enter into that? By obedience to Christ. The obedience that Christ demonstrated in the Garden of Gethsemane, he calls us now to follow and to be. But our 21st century critical neighbour is going to say, yeah, that's fine. But let's be practical. How do I live in obedience to Jesus? What is Jesus calling me to do, to be? How is he guiding me? How do I know what I should be doing? Because he's certainly not going to guide us with the rule and the thumb in. We don't cast dice. What does God want me to do? So how does Jesus actually, how do you know what God's calling us to do? By the teaching of Jesus. That we read in the Gospels, that we understand because they're explained to us in the epistles, and that those are only really appreciate with a knowledge of not just the New Testament but the Old. Now that takes persistence, that takes perseverance, but that's what the Jesus, our high priest, calls us to do.